Hi, this is Lindsay Oden, Special Research Assistant at the Washington State Attorney General's Office, and this is your AGO Moment in History. In this series, our office will be releasing clips from our Oral History Project, an ongoing effort to collect and preserve the history of the Attorney General's office as told by the people who have worked here over the years. In this episode, our current Attorney General Bob Ferguson interviews former Attorney General and U.S. Senator Slade Gorton. Senator Gorton served 3 terms as Attorney General of Washington State from 1969 to 1981. He was later elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served 3 terms from 1981 to 1987 and from 1989 to 2001. In this clip, Senator Gorton describes his decision to run for Attorney General of Washington State and the closely contested election that followed. He also describes his transition from serving in the Washington State House of Representatives to running the Attorney General's office. Let's listen.
In the book that John Hughes writes a wonderful biography about you, by the way, and I think he mentions that in 1967 you start thinking about running for Attorney General, the way he puts it. I think it's one thing I wanted to ask about is kind of go back to that time when you really were first starting to think about running for Attorney General. What I'm curious about is, who are the kind of folks you spoke to? Who was your kitchen cabinet who you talked about in making a decision whether or not to run for Attorney General? Just kind of curious about that decision-making process that you went through, presumably back around 1967.
I served 10 years in the State House of Representatives at a time at which the legislature only met every other year during odd-numbered years. In 1966, a good year for Republicans. The Republicans won a majority in the State House, but not the State Senate. And I was elected majority leader, I guess largely because I had been the Republican redistricting captain a couple of years earlier, and Republicans gave me undue credit for the majority that they gained. In any event, I had the position while Dan Evans was governor. And I think, looking back on a long career in politics, I'm not sure there was any period of 4 months in that time that I had more fun than the concentrated short session, really carrying out many of Dan Evans' policies and seeing to it that they passed in law. I can say, running for Attorney General or any other position than running for re-election never occurred to me during that 1967 session of the legislature. Didn't at all. I was totally concentrating on what I was doing, and I don't think that we absolutely knew that the Attorney General, John O'Connell, was going to run against Evans at the time. No, it came up from a single suggestion. Another Republican state representative from here in Seattle, Mary Ellen McCaffrey, had been the president of the Seattle League of Women Voters and was one of my closest friends and allies in the legislature. Sometime not long before Christmas in 1967, said, Slade, you ought to run for Attorney General. And that really started it. Sort of, why not?
So that's interesting. So in the book Hughes mentions, you mentioned that story. I guess I sort of thought there must have been some greater thought given before that. But you're saying really no, it was...
If there was, I have no memory of it.
Interesting.
And my memory is, wow, Mary Ellen, I hadn't thought of that before, but it sounds like a pretty good idea.
Yeah.
Because, as you know, it's a wonderful job in which you combine both the practice of law, which we're trained to do and ought to like and do, and you're in politics at the same time. And just about the only job that offers those twin advantages. And so in any event, you say, what was the group of people who got me started? I can't tell you. I think I was something of a self-starter. But the advantage I had, the single advantage I had, was because I'd been a legislator for 10 years, I knew people in every part of the state. There was always a state senator or state representative or former member in any community I went to for the first time who could get me my first speaking engagement, who could tell me who the really good lawyers were in town to go and talk to about running for Attorney General. And so one of the things I most remember about that is, I was still a relative newcomer to the state. There were lots of places in the state in which I'd never set foot at the time that campaign started. There ended up being 7 candidates for office that year, 5 Democrats and 2 Republicans. None of them were particularly well known. The 2 of the Democrats, Fred Dorr, a state senator, and John G. McCutcheon, a former prosecuting attorney in Pierce County, had a little bit of name familiarity to begin with, but probably not much more than mine as a state representative. And in the old blanket primary, like our present primary with all the candidates on the same ballot, it ended up by being a unique election in a number of respects. 7 candidates. I finished first, but the man who finished 7th had more than half as many votes as I did.
Wow.
It was I had barely over 22% of the vote, and won the Republican nomination. But then it went 21, 19, 17, so on, down to something like 11 or 12 for the last one. A reflection on the fact that we weren't very well known.
Sure.
I remember the Democrat who finished 3rd was named Don Abel. And I can remember to this day the bus card saying "Elected Able Attorney General."
He's got an easy slogan there.
He had a great and easy slogan.
Yes.
Mr. Rutland, I was very envious.
And then I was interested in reading the Hughes book that I didn't realize how close that general election was. After you got through the primary, and you went on to the general election against McCutcheon.
The general election was decided in
5,000 at 5,000 votes. You won by. You're down on election night, then you pulled it out. And so, where were you on election? Just out of curiosity, where were you on election night? Do you recall where the party
on election night, I was at whatever the big Republican Party was, probably the Evans headquarters, because of course he was running for re-election as governor.
Sure.
The presidential, let's see, this was 68.
That's right. But you wouldn't have realized you were Attorney General until some days afterwards because the absentee ballots had to come in. Is that correct?
Quite a long time.
I see. Okay.
It wasn't. I couldn't go down to Olympia and start interviewing people and talking to people probably until the 1st of December.
And do you have any recollection? I know it's been a lot of years, but do you recall the moment when you realized you were going to win? Is that a memory that you have when it actually dawned on you were going to pull this out?
I had a I think he was probably still a student at the University of Washington, who was one of these election gurus, who told me I was going to win the day after the election when I was still behind, and predicted that it would be 5,000 votes.
No kidding. No kidding.
I can't say that I was absolutely certain on that basis, but I know that he did that. He just studied the absentees of previous elections and so on, and so forth. And I did gain every day they reported votes. When it was an absolute certainty, probably when they made the formal validation
exactly,
I got the certificate of election.
Yeah, interesting. So then, one question I really was interested to get your perspective on was, unlike me, you served in the legislature, as you mentioned, and you were a leader there, obviously, and played a really integral role on many issues facing the state. I never worked in Olympia. In stark contrast to you, I was curious in becoming Attorney General, and particularly in that first term as Attorney General, did you find that your experience working in the legislature, what were the pros and cons of that? I can imagine the legislators knowing you well, some of those were partisan battles around redistricting. There was probably some elbows flying around redistricting, and some folks are very appreciative of your work. Some, hey, you know what?
It was
on the other side. It was a plus.
It was a plus. And it was a plus even with people whom I had been opposed to in the legislature. Because they knew me already. And certainly in those times, money was difficult, but as it is for you, appropriations were difficult. But I was treated relatively well. I think I'd like to go back on what
please do.
As long as we're doing it.
Please do.
There were about 100 assistant attorneys general at the time that I was elected. And I vowed to and did interview every one of those who hadn't announced that they were leaving. One of my Democratic opponents was the office candidate, and he went on, and I never saw him. But there were only maybe 2 or 3 others in addition to that who just plain took that opportunity to leave. And I I think there may have been one whom I didn't feel comfortable with, but by and large, I thought continuity in the office, was going to be a good thing.
Right.
But the interesting personal story about it is, under John O'Connell, there was the Attorney General, there was the Chief Assistant Attorney General, and 98 Assistant Attorneys General. There were no differences in titles at all. And the Chief Assistant Attorney General was a man named Bob Doran, who later, for a long time, was a very distinguished Superior Court judge in Thurston County. And I had known Bob because we had been in a couple of state Supreme Court cases together and liked him. And he organized all of those December interviews for me, and was very objective on who was good, who was just so-so, and the like. But he never put himself on the list of people to be interviewed. And so the last day that I interviewed the last one, I said, "Bob, how about you? What's your view? Do you want to stay?" And Bob said, "Well, I was the chief assistant to John O'Connell, and I just felt he'd want somebody else, and so I'm really ready to go out and look for another position." It was obvious that he liked what he was doing, but he didn't want to put me in an awkward position. I said, "Heck no, I really want you here. You know about this office. We'll probably organize it a little differently, but yes, I'd very much like to have you stay." 9 months to the day, his wife had a baby.
You're sort of the godfather.
So I always considered myself to be the godfather.
That's a great story. That's a great story. And also a testament to the independence of the office, right? That even someone who had been a key, had a key role in the previous administration, John O'Connell, of course, being a Democrat, you being a Republican, sort of goes that independence of the office, which I think is an important
And I
part of
created
our
a
culture.
situation with 4 deputy attorneys general, and 3 of them were people who had been there under O'Connell and are still friends of mine.
Interesting. And let's talk a little bit about that transition. I want to spend a little bit of time about that, because that's a big change in your life. You're going from being a state legislator to now running a very large law firm with, as you said, about 100 attorneys and a large professional staff. I guess I just was curious to get your impressions of what that transition was like, to go from being a legislator to now being an executive, or running a large law firm. Maybe just talk through what some of your philosophies were of running that large law firm, what some of those challenges might have been, if you felt they were challenges to you in making that transition.
Well, I think I found out, I suspect you found out the same thing when you ran for Attorney General. People want you to answer all kinds of questions that don't relate to being Attorney General. And it's not good to say, that's not the job I'm seeking. You want to talk to the candidate for auditor or governor. You answer the questions.
Yes.
So, yeah. And it's fortunate that you do so, because when I was first running, even more than when you were, the number of independent responsibilities of the Attorney General are pretty small. The great bulk of those 100 lawyers, and of yours several hundred, work for the state agencies. This was easy in my first 2 terms, and a little bit more difficult in my 3rd term. The agencies set their policies. The Attorney General doesn't. And unless you are just convinced that they're so totally wrong that there's no reason whatsoever for their position, you defend them. You defend their position. Which is why consumer protection, which is a direct responsibility, is such an interesting part of the job, and why some other aspects of it where you can show your own independence are so. Looking back on it, there was one respect in which I think I was really dumb. And that is, beginning in my 2nd term, for my 2nd and 3rd terms, I argued 14 cases in the United States Supreme Court. I think more than any other state attorney general had during that period of time. I didn't do it during my 1st term. And there were 2 or 3 cases that went to
So there were possibilities. You had some options there,
that I could have elected to do. But it was when I was first reelected, they said, don't do it. This is going to be the most fun you'll ever have as a lawyer.
Right.
And I took it over with some criticism. I may say. Before that, the assistant attorney generals who had handled the case took it to the Supreme Court. In many other states then, and I suppose some now, they were outside hotshots
Yes.
who were hired to do the job. I found after I decided to do that and got into it that there were many respects in which it was absolutely the right thing to do, leaving aside the quality of the lawyer. The lawyer, say here or anywhere else, who'd spent 2 or 3 or 4 years on the job, saw the case differently than someone who was seeing it for the first time.
Right.
And the Supreme Court justices were seeing it for the first time. And so to have someone who sort of was looking at the case in which they were ended up, in my view, being an advantage. That doesn't answer your question as to how I went into the transition.
Right.
So, but obviously I didn't go into it perfectly, or I would have made that.
You had a different decision,
earlier.
But did you find that to be a challenge, making that suddenly being an executive, running a large law firm? It's a big change in the work that you're doing. Was that, or did you find that was a fairly smooth transition?
I reorganized the office in sort of the way that you have it today, with deputies and senior assistant attorneys general. And I think the mark of a good manager is a good ability to delegate. You can't supervise 100 or 300 or 500 people. You can supervise half a dozen to a dozen, maybe. And that's the way we did it from the very beginning. And I had my first chief deputy attorney general, who was also a former legislator, who was very good on personal relationships and did it quite well. Then I had a chief deputy who was not at all good.
Yes,
and eliminated. After which point I didn't have a chief.
Right.
I just had 4 deputies, and each of them had a certain number of sections under him.
Right.
And we supervised it in that fashion. The one thing I did do was to interview everyone who we were going to hire, and because I'm from the East and my family were back East, I began in my very first year having a week or 10 days interviewing in Eastern law schools, so that I could see a couple of my college's football games
at the same time,
and see my family at the same time.
Yeah.
I found that my own law school, Columbia, was not a good source for us. I went there a couple times and then abandoned this. But we did, from time to time, hire lawyers from Harvard and Yale and Boston University, are the ones that I particularly remember. And much of the interviewing out here, the initial interviewing, was done by one of my deputies, but always the final candidate came the same way.
I see. And then how would you, that's interesting, so then how would you describe when you came into becoming Attorney General, in terms of just the culture of the office? You know the office pretty well to this day. You've watched it closely over the years. While it was smaller, do you have a sense of what the culture of the office was when you became Attorney General?
I think that when I took it over, many of the more senior assistant attorneys general had a stronger feeling toward their client than they did toward the attorney general.
Interesting.
And I suspect I was somewhat more hands-on than John O'Connell was, because we'd have staff meetings with the senior members. And we also, within the frame of reference of the amount of money we had, tried to both promote and give raises on merit. And that required the deputies and the seniors to have a pretty good knowledge of the people who were working for them and to make those recommendations for me. But everyone knew that I had the final say on what their salaries were going to be. And I suspect that probably created a little bit better intra-office morale. We also had a very good basketball player who got the Attorney General's office a number of games in which I would play occasionally. And the same thing with softball. So we had office activities to try to build up a degree of esprit de corps among the lawyer staff.
That makes sense.
Thanks for listening to this AGO moment in history. Be sure to like and subscribe to receive updates when we upload a new episode. On our next episode, Senator Gorton describes his decision to sue the American League to try to keep professional baseball in Seattle, which is possibly the case he is best known for. Thanks, and talk to you again soon.